Unintelligible. I don't know how to fix this. See. Can you hear me talking?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Let's see here.
Hey, Thomas. Looks like you got it now. Just make sure you check the little box that says share audio before you share your screen.
Good morning, Denver. We hope you're having a wonderful start to your Friday. We really appreciate you attending this presentation, and I think you're going to like it a lot. My name is Ephraim Hentz. I'm an associate with Polsinelli. Polsinelli is a national law firm with over 900 attorneys, with 20 plus offices countrywide. I sit here in the Denver office currently, and I practice in the data privacy group with a focus on technology transactions. My colleague and friend.
Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Weber. I'm also an associate here at Polsinelli in the Denver office. I'm also in the technology transactions and data privacy group. My practice primarily focuses on data privacy in incident response or breach realm, and also in data compliance work. So I'm happy to be here, and we look forward to discussing more.
Great. And so, as you all have probably can tell by the title of this presentation. Today we'll be discussing an ever-evolving, never boring, except on Fridays, I can imagine, topic, which is the evolution of data. In my lifetime, data has evolved from something I believe society used to see as a nuisance or a waste of time to becoming a new hot commodity that promotes, really at the core of data, is promotion of efficiency and innovation. Data provides competitive advantages, but it also comes with risk and fear. And so just to start, we kind of want to give you a little background, a little historical context with data. And to begin, let's just take a moment to remember back to the late 1990s. Yes, I was only about 8-9 years old at that time, but from my recollection, computers were not common in the general population's home. And if you were lucky enough to own a 5,000-pound desktop computer, it was likely you had internet that downloaded at a rate of 10 megabytes per minute, or did not have internet, and only used your computer for solitaire. However, Y2K arrived. The world didn't end, but my personal opinion, world's greatest technology boom occurred. By the mid 2000s, at that point, we're seeing computers are prevalent in homes, and internet started morphing into now, into the now ever-changing thing that it is. In the late 2000s, I would say, from my perspective, is when we saw internet speed pick up. Society realized that the faster the internet became, the easier it was for us to communicate in real time to each other across the country. When the internet sped up, we realized that we could create interactive websites that would allow users to provide their comments and their thoughts and their beliefs on topics, and that social media giants became a thing at this time as well, when users now are able to post pictures that download in seconds to their social media pages to share with their aunts and wherever they're at throughout the world. And so brings us to the 2015s, 2020s, really an explosion of the transferring of data. Individuals at this point, this is when, just for a couple of examples, the Uber came out, I believe, in around 2013, 2014, or really became a thing in the central part of the country, 2014, 2015. And this is just one example of the transferring of data to consumer to business, to order a ride, for efficiency, for innovation. Just one of many examples of kind of the explosion that we saw during this period in 2015, 2016 area. Now, modern days, kind of as I've been discussing, we don't see data as a nuisance anymore, but really it's a substantial data pipeline used on a daily basis between consumer to consumer. This data pipeline and the demand for services, this data pipeline has created the demand for services to store, protect, analyze, or monetize data. Enter data as a service companies. Let's take a step back and just get to the root of what data as a service means. Data as a service is a data management strategy that uses cloud technology to store, protect, integrate, process, analyze, or delete data over the internet. Data as a service can provide startups or any businesses, but let's focus on startups for this point of this discussion, of certain advantages such as agility. Now, internal users within companies can move quickly through the data due to the simplicity of the data, of how to access the data, and the simplicity of the formatting of the data. We're seeing it's cost effective. Data as a service is for a lot of startups. Data as a service offers startups the ability to cheaply store, protect, and or analyze their data off-site. So it's not taking up room in the physical locations. We're seeing data as a service improve data quality. Data as a service is data as a service. One of the key components is to improve the quality of the data. And that comes with organizing the data, formatting the data, and providing written analysis of the data. Another key part about data as a service is I think that it kind of eliminates the number of cooks in the kitchen. It's limiting the access to the data, which is a reasonable safeguard that Thomas will talk about later, but it also is improving the quality of the data by limiting the number of people that can revise the data, amend the data, of course, access data, and then delete the data. By limiting the number of people that have these administrative abilities, the data will remain in the same shape that it should be in, and the quality will stay the same. You know, there should be no doubt at this point that data as a service is a very lucrative industry, and we're seeing big data as a service as kind of a prime example of that. Big data as a service, this comes in the equation again because of the substantial creation of data occurring presently, and the demand to modify this data for the data to be flexible and affordable, or to have the data managed at an affordable rate. All of this is to just kind of go back to the point that data is the new gold. It should be noted that we chose the title of this presentation because we understand how intertwined our beautiful state of Colorado is with commodities. When reviewing the history of Colorado, it's impossible not to notice the impact of commodities had on the state. Gold miners raced across America in the 1800s to Colorado and other Western states looking for gold. And through the entirety of the 1900s and into this millennium, oil has reigned supreme and caused a boom or bust market here, especially in Denver. But now, you know, I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind that you know, data is truly the most supreme commodity in the world. Data is now a primarily economic asset for many individuals and companies throughout the world. Data helps organizations improve their operations, increase and create revenue streams, and improve the quality of current products. In fact, I bet some of you in the audience work for emerging companies that have revenue streams or desire to create revenue streams through the exchange of information for goods and services, or turning data assets into cash by selling them to other users. Some of the most valuable companies in the world, as we all know, are big data as a service companies. In 2018, big data as a service was valued at around $5 billion. That same big data as a service market is expected to grow in valuation to around $61 billion by 2026. Data as a service market is the data as a service market is projected to grow $30 billion in value between 2021 and 2025. You know, I mentioned the reason for this, you know, incredible growth and valuation in this commodity is just the growing amount of data that is just, you know, it's just the growing amount of data is probably one of the most prominent factors I would go with. Large volumes of data are being generated from many sources such as the internet, mobile devices, and social media. And this increase in the volume of data is, you know, it's just causing us to really have a demand to be able to use this data in an efficient manner, to manage this data in an efficient manner, and to use the data competitively in a competitive advantage manner. Some of the big players, as one can imagine, would be Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Those are the new big players, but historically, data as a service, big players were Bloomberg, Oracle, and they've been around for decades. The original goal of those heavyweights back in the days, and this is 90s and early 2000s, was to provide cloud computing services to host and store data. When cloud computing services came on the scene originally, it was just so that a company could take their data outside of their business and put it into someone's server in a housing environment in a cloud, and then be able to access that at some form or fashion. Nowadays, we're looking for cloud computing services have evolved into shared cloud computing services, allowing consumers real-time access to data with a focus on integrating, analyzing, and processing the data for the benefit of the customer. So let's just take a little look at how you would go about getting data as a services, or just kind of the general overview of the process for data as a services. Data as a services are generally offered on a subscription basis, meaning the customer will enter into an agreement with the entity that will restrict and regulate the customer's use of the services. And how we would want it as an attorney is we would want to regulate the customer's use of the services to the purposes of the agreement. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. The agreement will also outline the prohibited conduct that the user must avoid while using the services. And then the agreement will provide the limited right or limited license to the user to use the services outlined in the agreement, or applicable order form. It's important to note with these software as a service, or I'm sorry, not software as a service, but data as a service agreements or master agreements, to always confirm that that these agreements protect your rights and your license to your data. If you're the startup, or if you're the buyer on that end, or if you're the data as a service company, it's always important to have your master agreements protect your rights and your license and your IP to the services you're providing. Certain from a startup perspective, buying these data as a service services, certain data services entities will try to attempt through these agreements to gain unlimited or unnecessary rights or license to your data. And so, or they may also try to limit their obligations to you, concerning if they lose your confidential information, or if their services fail to provide fail to fulfill the obligations under the agreement, or if they discontinue their services without telling you. These are all provisions that should be reviewed carefully in these master service agreements, subscription agreements, or license agreements. Excuse me. Generally, data as a service entities are providing services surrounding very sensitive information. A lot of these agreements will contain provisions outlining the data as a service entities, and also the customer's obligations surrounding personal information that might be transferred from entity to data as a service company, or customer to data as a service company. And then protected health information, payment card information, sensitive member information. All of this information might be is very commonly involved in these data as a service agreements. So now let's jump into and discuss probably a hot topic for this presentation is potential risk. As you can see on the slide, we have 3 potential risks outlined. From a consumer perspective, the first thing to note there is consumers are going to will be worried about data breaches. Threat actors all over the world are keying in on companies that manage, process, and store data, aka data as a service entities, or even startups that aren't providing a data as a service but are just have a lot of data. These threat actors are keying in on these companies, and breaches are an unfortunate common occurrence in today's society because of this. Threat actors know that a lot of these entities that are providing these type of services are you know, they hold or maintain a lot of data. So those are the companies that we should be going for from their perspective. If you're a startup, if you're from a startup perspective, you're thinking about engaging a data as a service company to provide certain services, we need to make sure that you review the entity's master agreement and any corresponding agreements or addendums, data processing addendums, online service terms, privacy policies, etc., to determine if the entity maintains sufficient safeguards to protect your data, the startup's data, from unauthorized access. The data as a service entities notice obligations should also outline in these agreements. Let me take a step back. I apologize. These agreements should also outline the entity's notice obligations when a security incident happens, i.e., data as a service entity should immediately notify the startup, or within 72 hours notify the startup of a data security incident. And then these agreements should also, finally, should outline the process and procedure the startup will take when a potential breach occurs. Another consumer concern would be the reduced visibility into the storing, protection, and maintenance of the data. Consumers are just going to be worried that the data is not stored carefully, and that a data as a service company might be a little lax in how with their safeguards. And from a business perspective, damage. One thing you're probably, I'm guessing most of the audience is worried about is damage to your reputation. Consumers will quickly lose trust in a data as a service company or a startup if the data as a service entity has a data breach, fails to uphold certain contractual obligations. The market right now for data as a service companies is pretty saturated. And with that being said, if there is an incident that affects the data that your company may be maintaining or holding or protecting, your business will lose a lot of reputation. Finally, let's discuss implications to future business deals. It's another from a potential risk from a business perspective. Data as a service, a data as a service entity, when you're just thinking about negotiating a merger acquisition, meaning you're going to buy another company or you're getting bought by another company, you need to just be very concerned or not concerned, but also very careful when it comes to the data issue. If the data is a big part of the merger and acquisition, meaning that the buyer is wanting to acquire your company with your company's data, the buyer is going to want to know who owns or who possesses this data currently, who has the full rights and license the data, and what has been the life cycle of the data. Specifically, buyers will need to clearly understand what information, what data the seller owns, maintains, collects, or sells in its normal course of business to determine the valuation of the seller. If the seller believes that they own data, but actually they, through one of those agreements I was talking about earlier, don't own the full rights to the data, the buyer is likely going to likely going to offer to buy the seller at a lower price. Buyers should, when you're in negotiations for these mergers, acquisitions, deals, buyers should include due diligence questions or requests for information to determine the seller's privacy practices and policies concerning what data is core to the seller's business value. Has the seller secured its rights or title to the data, or does the seller only have limited non-transferable rights to the valuable data? And finally, is the at-issue data governed or restricted by additional contractual or regulatory limitations that would affect the transfer of data after signing? And so now I'm assume that you all are tired of hearing my voice. I'm tired of speaking. So let me turn it over to my colleague Thomas to discuss the regulatory piece.
Thanks, Ephraim. Thanks for sticking in there with us, everyone. I'm going to discuss the regulatory risks associated with data as a service companies and startups in general. I'm going to do a kind of high-level overview of laws and regulations. So bear with me here. I know it's probably almost lunchtime, and the last thing I'm going to do is discuss robust and boring laws, but I think this stuff will come in handy for your businesses. So first and foremost, in federal law in the United States, the FTC has general authority to enforce against businesses that deal in unfair and deceptive trade practices. It's important to know there's no overarching federal law, but more of a piecemeal network between different sectors and industries. But as far as the FTC is concerned, I wanted to highlight a few instances where the FTC can come down on your company. Failure to implement and maintain reasonable data security measures, failure to follow a published privacy policy or privacy notice, as it's also called, and failure to provide sufficient security for the personal data that the company maintains. Or a few examples. There's a host of others, but I wanted to highlight those because I think those will be important to everyone in the audience. Moving to state-specific laws, the big one that comes to mind are data breach laws. Again, no overarching federal law. Every state has its own data breach notification law. They're similar for the most part, but with important differences. And it's important to note that if a quote unquote breach, which is a legal term, or if your company suffers a data breach, it's not only the law which the company is based, it's not only the state law which the company is based, but the law is actually based on the individual residency of any impacted individual. So for example, a Colorado startup that suffers a data breach, but has customers in California, let's say, or Texas, those laws would come into play as well as Colorado's if there's any Colorado consumers as well. And I'll touch more on data breach laws, particularly in Colorado here in a second. In Colorado, as it applies to the data breach laws, the law requires notification of security breaches affecting the personal information of Colorado residents. I'll discuss the definition of personal information in a second, but basically the law, it's a notification law. So you want to avoid having of course, you want to avoid data breaches any way we can, but two, you want to avoid, if you have to, notify individuals of such, which is the big, can hurt your reputation, as Ephraim was discussing earlier. Also, in certain circumstances, if there's more than 500 Coloradans involved in a data breach, the Attorney General of Colorado would be also need to be notified. What is a breach? Technically, a breach, again, a legal phrase, is the unauthorized acquisition of unencrypted computerized data that compromises the security, confidentiality, or integrity of the personal information maintained by a business. What are some examples of breaches? One that you might think of, and you'd be right to consider that it could possibly be a breach because it's been in the news so much lately, would be a type of ransomware attack. Certainly this could constitute a breach depending on the circumstances if personal information is impacted. But some other ones where, some other examples where I don't know if it's on your radar or not, but let's say a employee with a mobile device or a computer loses their briefcase, which contains the mobile device or computer. That could also constitute a breach if the personal information is stored in there and other circumstances in that. So we keep talking about personal information, which is kind of the meat and potatoes of these laws. Personal information is something that relates to an individual, and each state defines it a little bit differently. But for the most part, there's three data elements or provisions within the definition of personal information that every state has, including Colorado. And that would be social security number, a driver's license number or identification card number, and credit card or debit card number or financial account with accompanying security code, access code, or password that would permit access to the account. Moving on to comprehensive data privacy laws. So far, right now, there's three states rather that have passed comprehensive privacy laws: California, Virginia, and Colorado. Colorado's I'm going to discuss on the next slide, but it was just recently passed by Governor Polis, and I'll touch on that in a little more specifics just in a few moments here. Another thing to be aware of, if your data as a service company or your startup deals in certain industries, there are specific laws and regulations that will apply to your business. For example, if there's healthcare data or PHI or a financial institution data, or even insurance companies, if you handle or manage these types of data, there's a possibility that these specific laws and regulations could apply. These apply they can be a lot of times at the federal level and also sometimes at the state level. Other than the comprehensive privacy law, I wanted to highlight a few Colorado laws that are currently on the books as far as data maintenance requirements and data destruction requirements. As far as data maintenance, Colorado law requires that certain businesses maintain reasonable security procedures to protect personal information. Along these same lines, there's also a requirement that if you use a third-party service provider that also handles or has access to the personal information of Colorado residents, you must require the service provider to implement and maintain these reasonable security procedures that are appropriate to the kind of personal information that you maintain. And also, currently on the books is a data destruction law. If you maintain personal information, either in paper or electronic form, you are required to develop a written policy to ensure that this personal information is properly destroyed or disposed of when it is no longer needed. I wanted to highlight a few things as well as far as what this ramifications can be of non-compliance. Again, different state laws can come into play with data breaches, and fines and penalties vary across the board. But there's also one thing as a lawyer, as we always want to try to avoid, is potential litigation. Some statutes do have a private right of action, which means consumers can sue your company. Okay, the Colorado Privacy Act. As I alluded to earlier, this is just recently signed into law by Governor Polis. As you can see, it's not effective yet. That's going to happen in a little less than 2 years, but there will be a look back period of 12 months. So in reality, businesses that are subject will need to start compliance in a little less than a year. Who is subject to this? As it's written, businesses that control or process the personal data of 100,000 consumers during a calendar year, or derive revenue or receive a discount on the price of goods, or services from the sale of personal data and processes or controls the personal data of 25,000 consumers or more are subject to this. What's a consumer? A consumer is a Colorado resident acting in an individual or household context. So some of you might be thinking, well, we won't be subject to this, but it could come into play depending on the size of your organization. And I just wanted to put it on your radar because it's something definitely to take note of and know that it's out there. I'm just going to run through this rather quickly. I know I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but there are certain obligations on businesses that are subject. 9 main obligations to be exact. I wanted to highlight a few that I think are particularly relevant. There's a duty of transparency, which means a business must post a reasonably accessible, clear, and meaningful privacy notice or privacy policy, as you might know it as well. There's a duty of purpose specification. So the business needs to specify the express purposes for which the personal data is collected and processed. There's also a duty of care. This requires businesses to take security precautions during the storage and use of data. These measures must be appropriate to the volume, scope, and nature of the personal data processed. And finally, something that Colorado kind of borrowed from the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, also known as the GDPR, is that if your company uses a third party or also known or a service provider, which would be a third party, also known as a processor in some circumstances, this processing needs to be governed by a contract. The contract in particular must establish the processing instructions to which the processor is bound, including the nature of the processing, the type of personal data subject to the processing, and the duration of the processing, along with some other legal obligations. The CPA also provides consumers, again, this would be Colorado residents, consumer rights. Just to run through these quickly, these consumers will have the right to opt out of targeted ads, sale of their personal data. They have a right to access the data the company has collected about them. They have a right to correct the data that's been collected about them, and the right to request that the data collected about them is deleted. Finally, I just wanted to touch base really quickly on enforcement and consequences of noncompliance with the Colorado Privacy Act. Good news is, if an enforcement action is taken on your company, you have 60 days to cure the violation before any fines are levied. And lastly, these can be costly infractions and consequences if there is noncompliance, up to $20,000 per violation. Moving on. Okay, this is kind of the fun part of the program. We wanted just to highlight a few examples of FTC enforcement against data as a service entities. So just to kind of surmise a particular instance, the FTC came down on a company for its failure to maintain a security program to protect consumers' sensitive data. And they also engaged in deceptive ads, which is something we probably don't need to tell you, but not a good idea. But they entered into a consent decree. A consent decree is essentially what the FTC can do where the business doesn't admit fault or promises to change its practices. And this is posted publicly on the FTC's website. And the details of these decrees they're meant to provide guidance about what practices the FTC considers inappropriate. This business entered into a consent decree and basically did not follow the consent decree. And this resulted in a $100 million penalty. So just wanted to highlight that if the FTC comes knocking, it's a good idea to take that seriously and do what they tell you to do. Another quick story is there's a interactive app company that told consumers that pictures and videos they would upload to this would disappear after a certain amount of time. What happened was this company actually had ways to store these videos and photos for quote unquote forever. And they also had a lack of safeguards for the personal data. And the FTC came down on them and they signed a 20-year consent decree to stop these practices. Okay, moving on to best practices for your companies. We're starting with internal controls, and then we'll discuss some external controls on the next slide. It's important to define the goals of your company associated with data. I mean, start small by outlining exactly what your goals are with your company's data. Knowing what you plan to do with the data you collect can help you keep only the information that is relevant and ensuring that your data management plan runs smoothly. Internal governance and data management plan kind of run together, but we wanted to highlight these important elements that you can put into practice for your companies. Put the right people in charge of your data and ensure that your team members know how to handle the data they are working with properly. It can be a good idea to set up particular logins and access permissions for people based on their specific role and data needs. So depending on your level, that's kind of where the hierarchy structure comes into play. Not everybody needs access to the same amount of data, and it can be very beneficial to set up different level of permissions to make it easier for your team members to access the necessary data, rather than trying to set up some type of blanket rule and permissions that can cause issues. I mean, they can be too restrictive in some cases, they can be too open for others, and this can lead to what we'd never want to see, which would be a data breach. What's FMA? Or MFA, sorry. Multi-factor authentication. Working closely in breach incidents, we see this a lot of times that breaches can be avoided if companies use multi-factor authentication. It's important to educate your organization on data management in general. Another thing we see is a lot of companies keep and continue to store just too much data for which they don't have use for anymore. By keeping only the data that your company is going to use, you're going to keep your data management plan efficient. Some written internal policies we wanted to highlight for you is first and foremost the WISP. So what's a WISP? It's a written information security program. As highlighted in the slide deck, some states even require this. For example, Massachusetts. But basically, what a WISP is it's a program designed for your company that encapsulates all your data security measures, as far as administrative, technical, physical safeguards, developing policies for storage, access, and any transportation of personal information and data. It can help you identify and access security risks applicable to your business. It can help with data retention policy, limiting access policy, and it's also important to have a policy about updating firewalls, security patches, antivirus and anti-malware software, amongst other things. And we also wanted to touch on training and resources. Encourage your employees to champion information protection by inviting them to the conversation. Data management is an entire organization effort, and training should begin at the top of each organization with a demonstrated commitment to creating awareness and compliance and a compliant culture. This can occur whether through town halls or other company-wide communications, but I guess the moral of the story is that data protection and privacy and security should be on everyone's radar within your company. Moving on. Best practices continued. Okay, now we can talk about some external controls that your company can implement. Vendor contracts. We kind of alluded this before, under the Colorado Privacy Act, but data processing addendums or data processing agreements can help your company maintain compliance, not only through laws and regulations, but also it's just a good practice to have. So you know that if your data is leaving your company, it'll also be secure. Again, some laws require this. GDPR, if your company happens to be subject to the GDPR, which means you're doing international, you have international clients. I don't want to get too much in the weeds into GDPR because that's just kind of a beast on its own. But something to be aware of if you do any work in the EU or the UK, there's certain requirements with DPAs. And also the CPA is going to require this as well, as we touched on earlier. Confidentiality agreements. This can be within your employees. It can be a good idea to have agreements within your company that employees sign these, so they know that, so you can kind of feel good about that the data that's at issue is secured. And I wanted to highlight some low-hanging fruit for companies and startups and data as a service companies. One thing you all should have is create and maintain a privacy policy. Certain laws require this in certain industries, but it's just a good idea to have and it's going to be needed under the CPA soon anyway. So something to put on your radar. Another low-hanging fruit is determine if you are regulated and who your regulator is, and determine what you need to do to comply with your particular regulator. And then lastly, I don't know we touched on this before, but just with our experiences, multi-factor authentication for data access and is just a good idea to have to secure your data. Another good idea would be to retain legal counsel for expertise, because data privacy laws in general can be confusing. They're international in scope. Again, there's no overarching federal law, which makes the piecemeal network can be hard to navigate at times. We know for startups, money can be tight, and lawyers can be expensive. Polsinelli, the firm we work for, is developing flat fee packages as opposed to the regular billable hour, in the hopes that smaller companies and startups can take advantage without it hurting their pockets too much. With that,
and with that, we're at the conclusion of our presentation. We really appreciate everyone taking the time out of your day to listen to us. And if there's any Q&A, we will be on to answer the questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much.